It is a great pleasure to welcome Marc Rod. Marc has the distinction of having given the longest bar mitzvah speech of any student at Congregation Emanu-El of Westchester.
Oh my.
And I always try with students who have a lot to say. I always try to like narrow down what they're going to say and like try to shorten it. But Marc was very clear that what he had to say needed to be there. And it turns out that it's a good thing he didn't let me cut it, because now he's writing for a living. And so it is clearly good that I didn't try to edit too much. Marc graduated college this past year, and even in this crazy world that we live in, was able to secure a position in his chosen field, which is journalism. He is writing for Jewish Insider, which is a, I'm gonna get this description wrong, Marc, so you can correct me once I'm done. But it's at minimum a daily newsletter that anybody can sign up for, with information relevant to the Jewish community, everything from national politics as it impacts the Jewish community, which is Marc's beat, and it even towards the end of that newsletter has birthdays of significant Jews. Whose birthday it is that day for significant Jews. So we get from the serious to the ridiculous in that same newsletter. But if you sign up for it, and I encourage you to, I get that newsletter every day. You'll find really interesting coverage. Again, everything from national politics to what's going on in the Jewish community to fun little tidbits like which famous Jew's birthday it is. So I'm going to, we invited Marc to speak today after Helene, his mother, forwarded me the incredible piece that he wrote from having been at the Capitol on January 6th. And I said, what an incredible opportunity to hear from someone who was there, to understand a little bit better what happened. In this age of social media, we've all been able to see a lot of what happened with all of the videos that have been going across our phones and across the TV. But that's different from hearing what it felt like to be there, and hearing a firsthand account. So I am very excited to welcome Marc, and I will now pass it off to him. Marc, please correct anything I said that was wrong, and then take it away.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Goldsmith, and also thank everybody. I want to thank everybody for being here. It's definitely an honor to be here, and an honor to speak to all of you. Rabbi Goldsmith, I think you actually described Jewish Insider very accurately. Like the rabbi said, we're a daily newsletter, or 5 days a week, Monday to Friday, focused on the Jewish community, and covering politics, business, philanthropy. We actually are expanding our philanthropy coverage. We announced today that we acquired another Jewish outlet that covers specifically philanthropy within the Jewish community, so that's very exciting. But not to plug us too much, but yes, just jewishinsider.com. You can sign up for the newsletter. We cover sort of everything from national politics to business to philanthropy to offbeat stories. My colleague got the first interview a few days ago with the woman who knitted those now famous mittens that Bernie Sanders was wearing at the inauguration a few days ago. So really just a good mix of stuff. Not all 100% Jewish focused either, if you want a little bit more variety. And yeah. So yes, really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you today.
Great. So Marc, why don't you start by telling us, actually, I think a little more background would be interesting. How did you end up writing for Jewish Insider? I think that little bit of context.
Sure. Oh, sorry. I think you.
Oh, sorry. I was on mute, wasn't I? Yeah, I was going to say, if you could first give us a little bit more context about how you ended up writing for Jewish Insider, coming right out of school. And then we'd love to get to the meat of this, which is your experiences at the Capitol on the 6th.
Sure. So I've been in journalism since high school. My first professional job in journalism was an internship with the Westmore News in Rye Brook and Port Chester, coming out of my junior year of high school. And I've been continuing to pursue journalism since then. It was also on the on the newspaper in my high school at Hackley, was the editor-in-chief when I graduated. And so when I got to college, continued in journalism, both on my high school or on my college newspaper, as well as doing internships outside. So I was with the local city newspaper out in Claremont, California, where I went to school. Then the following summer, I was here in DC covering politics for CNN. Subsequent summer, I was covering, again, primarily politics for CNBC. And then, I was applying throughout my senior year for post-graduation jobs. And I applied to a position with Jewish Insider, and I heard back from them around February, and excuse me, I'll shift the camera here a little bit. And they offered me the opportunity to come on part-time as an intern or a fellow with them for a few months. And I did that while I was, again, continuing to work on my college newspaper, was the managing editor at that point, and was continuing to work with Jewish Insider. I actually had been offered an internship with ABC News for this past summer, but then obviously the pandemic happened, and so that was canceled. And when it came to around when I was about to graduate, I'd been since I'd been home in March, I'd been kind of increasing my involvement with Jewish Insider, doing more and more work with them as school things wound down. At that point, I was particularly focused on covering congressional races. We were talking to congressional candidates all over the country, Jewish and non-Jewish, talking to them about their campaigns and their agendas. I think it was about 60 that I interviewed in total by the end of the campaign in November. But I'd been increasing the work that I'd been doing with Jewish Insider for a couple of months. And when I graduated, they offered me the opportunity to come on full time. And it just so happened that I was interested, obviously, in covering politics, as I've said, and they were interested in having a full-time person in DC. So I said, well, I'm your guy. And so I moved down to DC here in July, and I've been covering the Capitol ever since.
Mark, that's great. I have to say that I found that Jewish Insider's coverage of the congressional races to be particularly relevant. Being in New York in such a large market, a lot of the races across the country get a little lost, and it's so important to understand the makeup of Congress. It's just so vital, and so the coverage, each day really featuring a different race, different candidates, lent a lot of important perspective and context to what was going on nationally. And as somebody who's a Jewish professional, making sure that that it answered the questions that the Jewish community was looking at in particular was really helpful. So with that background, it's sort of on the one hand obvious why you were at the Capitol on the 6th, but if you want to talk about sort of getting that assignment, what you were anticipating for that day, given the threats that were out there and sort of the national mood, if you can start by telling us about, when you got the assignment and how you were feeling heading into it and what you were anticipating, I think that'd be a great place to start.
Sure. So I've basically since November, I've been at the Capitol whenever Congress is in session. So, and especially for a day like this, it was really just never a question that whether I was going to be there. It was, one of the big, we all knew that it was going to be a big news day just because of, we'd obviously known for a couple of months that there were going to be these challenges. And, going into it, there was definitely some awareness around the Capitol that things might get a little bit hairy. There had been some security alerts that had been reported from Capitol Police in the days leading up to it that were telling members that they should essentially avoid going outside and should instead use the tunnel system underneath the Capitol building and that connects it to the outer office buildings rather than walking out above ground through the grounds, because they knew there was going to be some sort of significant presence of protesters that day. But I don't think anybody anticipated that they would ever actually make it inside. I mean, when I was going in, I was steeling myself for the possibility that there was going to be some violence. We'd seen over the course of the prior few weekends, there had been sort of these repeated rallies by Proud Boys and QAnon people and people like that in DC, and some of them had turned a little bit violent. So I was steeling myself for the possibility that there might be some violent protesting going on that day. But I really never expected that they'd get past the barriers, much less get inside the building. And going in that day, I don't think the Capitol Police did either. I mean, just walking up to the buildings, I'd been expecting to see a pretty heavy security presence out and about, because again, there had been these warnings, and spending time on Twitter, spending time reading other news outlets, it was clear that there were plans for mass demonstrations, for potentially violent demonstrations, and that there was a contingent of people who had been planning this out in the open, that they wanted to try to storm the Capitol. So I'd been expecting, a larger security presence that just wasn't there when I got there that morning. There were certainly extra police officers roaming around inside the buildings, but in terms of the exterior, there were no extra barriers that I saw. There were no really secure fences, just sort of the low kind of portable fencing that you see at concerts and public events and things like that. And it didn't look, and the police weren't in riot gear or anything. It looked like not too much different from a normal day. So at that point, honestly, I was calming down a little bit. I said, okay, maybe they were just sort of putting up extra warnings to make sure that everybody was being careful, and that that things were not going to materialize as much as they thought. And the mood inside that morning, inside the press office where I was working, was pretty relaxed. People were, by 11, 12, people were really downplaying the threat or downplaying the significance of the inauguration count, because there was so much other big news happening that day at that point. The Georgia runoffs had just happened the previous night, so people were very focused on that. And then a couple of hours before the vote count was supposed to start, there was President Biden announced that he'd chosen Merrick Garland for Attorney General. So one reporter who I was sitting with said, "Oh, well, it looks like the vote count might not be even the biggest story today," which obviously was bad prediction on his part. But I think that really just is reflective of what the mood and what the thinking was on the Capitol a few hours into the day that day.
Was that mood, do you think, reflected or shared by the Congress people as well? Do you have any insight into how our representatives were feeling going into that morning?
I wasn't able to talk to anybody that morning because people were pretty much hunkered down in their offices getting ready for what was going to happen the rest of the day. But it didn't seem like there was much concern. Things were proceeding pretty much as planned throughout the course of the day. So there didn't seem to be any real disruptions going on at that point.
Got it. So when the count began, tell us sort of the beginning of the count, and then take us through from the beginning of the count and what was sort of going on in the congressional rooms, and then take us up to that moment when you realized something was wrong.
Sure. So basically throughout the morning leading up to the count, there had been a protest outside the day before along the east front, which is the side that faces the Supreme Court, sort of one of the two main long fronts of the Capitol. And there had been a protest the day before, not that big, but a couple hundred people. The day of when I got there that morning, there was about the same size crowd, but then that kept growing and growing over the course of the morning leading up to the vote count around 1 p.m. So at 1 p.m., we all lined up sort of in the rotunda and the statuary hall, which is sort of the next hall over that leads between the Senate chambers on one side of the building and the House chambers on the other. And basically what happens is the vice president and the senators there's a procession from the Senate chamber to the House chamber, and they're carrying these big ceremonial boxes with the electoral votes. And so we all lined up to watch that procession go through and, shout questions at the senators as they were going by. And so they all went into the chambers at the House for the initial start of the count. At that point, the crowds had gotten fairly large. And so just in case, and just so that I was able to really do the work that I needed to do, regardless of if there were lockdowns or anything like that, I ran back down to the office where I'd been working down in the Capitol Visitor Center, which is basically in the basement, and got my laptop, ran back up. By the time I got up, the crowds were again bigger, but the vote counting was still proceeding along. And then I'd say I think it was around 1:20, the first objection came through, which was Arizona. So, everybody lined up and filed all the way back to the Senate. And then they started the 2 hours of debate that was scheduled. And so, senators were giving speeches. I was listening into that on C-SPAN while on my phone, and I was, sort of shuttling back and forth across the building between the two chambers. And I think it was around 1:20, like shortly after the two houses broke up and went their separate ways, when I think there was the first indication that things might be getting worse. There was a bomb threat that was called in, or not a bomb threat. There was a suspicious package in one of the office buildings, and they put that building on lockdown. And then they were trying to evacuate it. And then there was a lockdown and a suspicious package in a second one of the office buildings. So at that point, I was thinking, okay, this is not looking super great. But again, I assumed that the police would at that point, be able to limit the scope of it to that. And at worst, maybe we'd end up in a lockdown inside the building for a little while. Again, never expected that anyone would get inside. But then I think it was just about exactly 2 p.m. I was looking out the windows on the east front of the building when I saw that some gaps had opened up in the fence on that side, and there were some people sort of trying to push through. The police that I saw, I know there have been some videos that have appeared to show police removing the fencing, but the police that I saw, at least from my vantage point, were trying to put it back in place. But then the whole group along the fence just started shaking it, and the whole thing toppled down. And then people sort of started trickling through, and then there were more and more people coming through from the crowd, which was a few thousand people by that point. And then I could see sort of vaguely, I didn't have as good a view of the other side of the building, but the crowd was a lot larger over there. And as I understand it, they'd actually already broken through the fencing at that point and were already sort of approaching the building, or had already approached the building at that point. But again, I couldn't see any of that from where I was. But what I saw was by the time I'd made it to the other end of the building, the House chamber from where I was walking, they'd already sort of climbed up to the front of the building, climbed up the steps, and were, and climbing on top of cars. There was really no police to be seen at that point because they were so outnumbered. And there was a congressman and a staffer who were standing next to me looking out this window, and the congressman just mutters, "Oh my God." And everybody, I think people were just stunned and shocked that, things had made it that far. Nobody expected that they would actually be able to, get past the fencing, get up to the building. And at that point I was saying, okay, this is not a good situation, and I should get to somewhere safe. And at that point, I figured the safest place to be was right outside the Senate chamber, because that was where all the vice president's Secret Service were. And I figured that was probably a good place to be. So I made my way back over to the Senate side. And even at that point, the police who were there and the Secret Service, they didn't seem that concerned. They were, kind of looking out the windows, trying to see what was going on, but it didn't seem like there was that much panic or concern at that point. So, I just took a seat in one of the chairs out there, pulled up my laptop, and was just trying to take notes and keep working and keep paying attention to what was going on. And then pretty suddenly, one of the police officers gathered me and a few aides who were milling around in this sort of lobby area up and said, okay, everybody needs to go down into the tunnels right now. We need to go. And so so I just sort of basically took off running at that point, went down the stairs. And I think at that point I got separated from the rest of the group that I was with, those other aides. And at that point I was realizing that in order to get down to the tunnels, I had to basically run directly across, directly in front of a door that led straight to the outside. And at that point I was saying, oh shoot, like, what if they're breaching that door? What if they're already inside? Like if they're right there and there's nowhere else for me to go, what am I going to do at that point? But, you know, I just sprinted as fast as I could and, you know, ran down those stairs, ran past the door, which thankfully I hadn't been breached at that point. Ran down the stairs into the tunnels, and then sort of started making my way over towards the house side in the tunnels. But the tunnels are very much a maze, and even having a few months experience there, I still get lost all the time. And the instructions on where I was supposed to go weren't really that clear. So at this point, I was sort of just wandering around, pretty much lost, not really knowing where I was supposed to go. And there was basically nobody down there. And then finally, at some point, I came across a police officer. He didn't know where we were supposed to go either. So he found his supervisor who told me to go over to one of the office buildings through the tunnels. Turned out that office building was on lockdown. So he didn't really have up-to-date information either, which I don't blame him for, obviously, sort of a very chaotic situation. But I think sort of, again, goes to show the lack of coordination that was happening at that point. It seemed like there was a breakdown in the command structure, I think, at that point, which I think has been pretty well documented in reporting since that point. So at that point, I was just sort of making my way over to those tunnels to get out of the main Capitol building over to the office building. And while I was going through, I came across a couple of police officers who were injured. There was one person who was clutching her arm and was saying, do you know where I'm bleeding from? Can you see where I'm bleeding from? And there was another guy whose face was just like stained red. And I thought that somebody had like thrown some paint at him or that he'd been pepper sprayed. But then as I got closer, I saw he had this big gash on his forehead, and I realized his whole face was just covered in blood. And that was very stunning. And that was just like the kind of, oh shoot moment when I kind of realized that, okay, this is in a really bad situation at this point. And you know, then I got into that tunnel that led over to the office building, and that was just, again, completely empty. And I'm just thinking, you know, if I get stuck down here, or if somebody gets into this tunnel, nobody's going to know. Who would know? Who would be able to find me down here? So, you know, just kind of went as fast as I could. Then got turned away at the first office building where I was trying to go, went down the tunnel a little bit more to the next office building over. And finally at that point, I found a big crowd of reporters and staffers and police. And at that point, I was finally sort of at a point where I was like, okay, this is a safer place to be. I'm where I'm supposed to be. I'm around other people. And so at that point, I was finally able to sort of start to relax a little bit. Oh, and one detail that I realized I skipped over was at the point sort of once the rioters had come up the stairs and had sort of approached the building, when you were walking through the halls, you could just hear this pounding, just this really loud pounding. And I think that was basically the people pounding on the front door, trying to get through the door, trying to knock through the windows. But it's obviously the Capitol as these big open halls and rotundas and these big lobbies and all of that kind of thing. So it's just echoing and echoing all throughout the building, and there's not really anybody wandering around. So it's just sort of this ominous, loud pounding sound. And that was very, very unsettling. So yeah, that basically gets you to when they breached and when they got into the building. So for the next few hours after that, I was basically hunkered down in a cafeteria in that office building with staffers and maintenance people and sort of all the other sorts of people who work on Capitol Hill. And at that point, basically the only news and information I was getting was from television, was from Twitter. And it was at that point that I found out that basically it seemed like they'd gotten into the building essentially right after I'd gotten out. So at that point, I was just feeling very lucky to have gotten out when I did. And, you know, I was obviously starting to see the same pictures that I'm sure a lot of you saw of, you know, people hanging off railings in the buildings, of obviously the guy with the fur pelt and the horns standing at the podium. And then that photo of the police officers who were crouched behind that bench trying to hold off people entering the House chamber. So really just a very harrowing scene at that point, just trying to figure out what was going on, how bad it was. And it was quickly pretty evident that things had gotten really bad and that the situation was just totally out of control and that the police had just completely lost control of the situation. And so, you know, was just down there trying to follow everything that was going on for a bit, letting everybody I knew know that I was okay. And I was tweeting pretty consistently at that point, just my observations, where I was, what was going on. And then it felt like several hours later, but it turns out it was about 45 minutes later, a group of Congress people who had been inside the chamber when the rioters had gotten through were escorted back into that building, into the cafeteria. So I was doing a few interviews with a number of different members of Congress about what they saw and what had happened in there. Wrote up a quick story about that. You know, I was just trying to get out as much information as I could.
Mark,
But there was, yes.
Mark, could you give us a sense of, you know, a lot of us have read accounts of what the Congress people experienced and what they saw. Could you give us a sense of sort of what their emotional state was?
Sure.
If they were, you know, nothing but the facts, ma'am, or if they were, you know, upset, if you were interviewing any you know, let's say allies of the mob, if they were excited, were people, did you feel kind of that you were having a shared traumatic experience with them? If you could describe that sort of emotional dynamic that was going on in that moment too, both for the reporters, for yourself, and for the Congress people you were talking to. I think that would give us some really interesting insight.
Definitely. I mean, nobody that I spoke to personally seemed excited or at all sort of, nobody was encouraging what was going on. Although there was another reporter who was somewhere near me in the cafeteria, who I think was with one of the sort of far right fringy cable news channels, who literally minutes after we ended up in that cafeteria was on air claiming that, oh, it was actually, they were getting evidence that it was actually leftists and not Trump supporters who had stormed the building. And literally within minutes of when the building had been breached, this was sort of already the line, which obviously in the days and weeks since has been proven to be utterly false. But you know, there was a range of reactions from the members of Congress. I think there were a lot of them who were trying to show a lot of resilience and sort of, there was definitely a big sort of mood that this is not who we are, this is not what people should be doing, and we're not going to cave to this mob. There was definitely some people who were really angry. You know, there was one of the reporters who I was talking to this person with asked, do you blame President Trump for this? And she was just sort of like, of course I do. And so there was definitely some anger from some people. People were definitely frightened, but I think we're trying to put on a brave face. I think more than anything else, people were just in shock, honestly. You know, again, nobody really thought that this was something that could ever actually happen. But you know, there was a mix even among the Republicans of sort of what the take was on this. there were some who were trying to defend the president and saying, this can't be his fault. He didn't tell them to do this. And obviously he didn't mean for them to come do this. There were others who were saying, the president misspoke. He should have been more clear that he wanted nonviolence, and his words were a mistake. So a mix definitely of what the reactions were. But there was definitely a sense of camaraderie. There were a couple of congressmen, one Republican and one Democrat, who said they were longtime friends, and they were, trying to support each other and talk up the bipartisanship and say, that how we deal with things is we talk about them and we negotiate and we argue, but we're friends, and this kind of rioting is not how Congress and not how America is supposed to work. So, I think there were a lot of people who were trying to put on a brave face, but there was definitely a lot of shock as well.
So people, when you were asking them, when people were commenting on Trump's role in the insurrection, were people aware of his remarks that had been made at the protest immediately preceding the storming of the Capitol?
A lot of them were, yes, because that had happened before the vote counting started. So a lot of them had, I believe, seen it before they came over, and obviously we as reporters, for the ones who were claiming not to be aware, we all had kind of pulled out, some of the particularly incendiary clips or things that he'd said to sort of confront them with.
I've always been struck when I've been to the Capitol for visits with Congress people, for lobbying visits with the reform movement or with AJC. I've always been struck how open the Capitol is, how anybody can walk into any of those office buildings. Which office building did you end up in, by the way?
I was in Longworth on the House side.
Got it. Okay. So I've always been amazed. You just walk in. I mean, you have to walk through a metal detector, but you don't have to say who you have an appointment with or anything like that. And I think my son, who's 11 years old, summed it up best. He said, "Don't they have locks on the doors? Isn't there bulletproof glass in those windows?" And he's a smart kid, but he's no security expert. Can you give a sense of or give your perspective on that sort of shock that most people are having? Like, how is that building not locked? How can anybody just walk in?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, for I think the past 9-10 months or so since COVID, the open Capitol policy has not been in place. It's been limited access only to people with sort of specific business and people who have official credentials, so staff and reporters. And even the reporters, a lot of them have been trying to sort of share duties among different outlets and different networks to reduce the capacity on the Hill. So, and like all of the offices are basically closed at this point to the public, and they're trying to have most of their staffs work from home. So the Capitol for the last 9-10 months has been sort of a very different beast than it has in the past. It's been pretty deserted and pretty quiet overall. But I mean, yes, there is supposed to be security. There's security at every door. There are bulletproof windows or reinforced windows and reinforced doors. But I mean, as you've seen, I'm sure from some of the videos, there was just a huge mass of people, and they just managed to smash through and push through. They were just through all of the different security measures that were in place, which is, I mean, just really shocking. But I mean, I think what it comes down to is sort of the outer perimeters were not that secure because, like you said, it's sort of a very open campus, and even sort of the outside campus, even if the insides of the buildings haven't been open, the grounds have still remained open, and there wasn't that much of an additional effort, like I said earlier, to close off the grounds for that day. There weren't any sort of secure fences, just sort of the kind of light metal fences that are more for directing people than anything else. And again, not sort of a heavy police presence outside. So I think it was just a matter of them being very underprepared, and it seems like underestimating the threat. obviously since then there's been a lot of finger pointing of the police says that the National Guard refused to come, and the National Guard says the police didn't request it, and this person's blaming that person, that person's blaming the other person. And I think it's going to be a while until we really get to the bottom of what exactly happened and whose failure it was. But it seems like there's plenty of blame to go around, certainly from the reporting that's come out. But yeah, I mean, despite the security that's supposed to be in place, I mean, I suppose the lesson of that day is, with enough people, even if the building itself is supposed to be secure, they can just, smash their way through.
When it's been well documented since the riots that there was a lot of anti-Semitic slogans on sweatshirts and anti-Semitic sentiment among the crowd. Were you aware of it that day? It sounds like it was probably too chaotic to really get that sense, but were you aware of it that day while it was going on? And in either case, what if you could give us sort of your Jewish insider perspective on the anti-Semitism that was woven into that moment?
Sure. I mean, it didn't surprise me that there was sort of a lot of anti-Semitic involvement with that. Obviously, we've seen a lot of different forms of anti-Semitic rhetoric and anti-Semitic beliefs cropping up among these sort of violent, far-right types, and even if not explicit anti-Semitism, kind of implicit anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic tropes being very much woven into the fabric of QAnon. And so it doesn't surprise me that was there, but on the day of, or at least while I was sort of running out of the building, I didn't know that was the case to the extent that it was. I couldn't really see any of like the t-shirts like Camp Auschwitz or anything like that from being across the plaza from the rioters. So I didn't, like I said, I didn't see anybody up close, thankfully. So I wasn't really aware of it until I got to that office building. At that point, I started seeing, some of the images coming out of the building, obviously, of some well-known neo-Nazi types in the building. The guy with the Camp Auschwitz shirt. So that was pretty frightening. But I was safe at that point, so I was a bit less concerned. But I was certainly very glad that I wasn't in the building at the time. And I think sort of over the course of the days following, as additional accounts had come out, the danger, people's sort of understanding of the dangers that had happened increased. And I know one report that particularly stuck out to me was from a New York Times photographer who said that when they saw her press pass said New York Times on it, and she'd been sort of in the crowd, they started, beating her and, trying to corner her and beat her. And, sort of reflecting on it with a press pass that says Jewish Insider on it, certainly with some elements of that crowd, I'm sure I would have faced a very similar reception. Well, so, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that's horrifying. Do you have either reporting and facts, or if not that, then what's your best guess or your intuition about what security is going to look like at the Capitol, into the future? Will groups of teenagers from Westchester be able to go and lobby their congressional representatives, or are we looking at a Capitol complex that looks more like the Kremlin with big gates and security around it all the time? From what you've seen, what do you anticipate? How do you anticipate maintaining that open American feeling that we're so proud of on the one hand, and on the other hand, making sure that there's appropriate security?
I mean, just to be frank, I think it's going to be difficult, and I think that it's going to be very much sort of a more closed off place than it has been in the past. I think that for better or worse, that's sort of an inevitability at this point. Right now, obviously, there's sort of the more secure fencing that's gone up, multiple layers of it all around the buildings, with razor wire on top and multiple levels of security checks, just to get within the grounds. And obviously, there's still a large National Guard presence. I'm not entirely sure what the plan for that is, how long that's going to stick around. I believe some National Guard left yesterday, but I think there's at least a portion of that that's remaining. But you know, there's definitely discussions ongoing among members of Congress about increasing the permanent security and what the future is going to look like. And obviously, there is no sort of permanent conclusion at this point. But I spoke to a congressman the day after, a couple of days after, I believe, or I guess it was last Wednesday, about he's trying to bring it to restart a plan that was begun number of years ago by the security chief of the Senate at that point, to basically put up a large wrought iron fence all around, basically something similar to what you see at the White House, and basically to severely limit access. I don't think the details of sort of what the public access would look like under that plan had been finalized, but you know, there's definitely discussions of having sort of that secure permanent fence in place. You know, just yesterday I overheard an interview another reporter was doing with Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, where he was saying that, you know, that the complex is probably going to be more closed off in the future, and, you know, trying to preserve access, but definitely the need for more security measures. But nothing's finalized at this point. But you know, I think it's inevitable at this point that the future of the Capitol is probably going to look more like it has over the past 10 months during COVID than it did sort of what it looked like before that.
The mood, at least among my friends on my Twitter feed and on my Facebook feed, is much lighter post-inauguration. Many congregants I've spoken with also feel a palpable sense of relief, and I'm wondering if that sense of moving towards more normalcy and less anxiety, if that's something that you find echoed now in the hallways of the Capitol and with the various politicians and journalists that you have contact with.
I mean, I think there's definitely a sense that, you know, especially over the past week or so, it seems like in the past few days, it seems like we're sort of back to business as usual in terms of everybody sniping at each other. And, you know, I think if there had been sort of any sort of bipartisan consensus that had formed in the days after, I think that sort of frayed a little bit. I know there was a press conference a couple of days ago with the House Minority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, where now he was sort of walking back what he'd said a few days prior about the president or the former president holding some responsibility for what had happened on the 6th, where he was now saying, you know, I don't think he was responsible at all. So I think certainly there is kind of a return to business as usual in terms of the partisan infighting, but you know, I think there is also a sense of relief that there was the you know, the discussions about potentially armed riots or armed protests either on the 17th or on the 20th didn't pan out. But I think that's in large part, and I think the consensus is that's in large part because there was such a heavy security presence and because they were prepared this time. Basically, people just stayed away. Excuse me, because they knew that there was that this was not going to go well for them this time. You know, I think there is a sense of returning to business as usual. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I will leave up to the people here. But you know, I think there is very much a return to, you know, the way things generally tend to go.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd be happy to open it up to questions. If people could put their questions in the chat box so we're not like sort of unmuting and talking over one another, I think that'd probably be the best way to handle this. So you can pop it on in there. There's one there already. Did Mark able to say which office building he ended up in? Oh, you told us that. Which was it again?
The Longworth building.
Longworth building.
Yeah, it's one of the sort of outermost buildings on the side of the house.
We have one question that popped up from Amy Lindsay. What were your parents thinking? And did they know that you were there in real time? Yikes. I don't know if you want to answer that or leave it to your parents to answer.
You know, I'm happy to open it up to them if they'd like, but they did know I was there. I think they were a little bit concerned, even the morning of, but you know, I kept them updated as I texted them as soon as I got to the Longworth building and told them that I was safe. That day also my mom started a Twitter account so that she could follow along with everything I was posting that day, because I think she said that I wasn't necessarily texting her, so she wanted to make sure I was safe and make sure that she was hearing from me.
Yeah, you know, there's something there's something profoundly symbolic in that. You know, Mark, in so many ways, you are the future, and in that moment, the future felt threatened. And it was, I'm sure, reflected very personally for your parents, and something that all of us felt for the whole country. So there was some of that in there. Okay, other questions for Mark? Okay, here we go. From Jane Dubrow, or Alex Dubrow. Is it Alex? I guess it's Alex. Can you tell us your thoughts about the conflicting reporting on what several security officials, will we know why it happened soon? Do we know already? I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I think sort of the picture is becoming clearer, in that there were a lot of different failures at a lot of different levels. I mean, I know there's been, the Washington Post has done some reporting over the past few days that's indicated that essentially the story coming out of the Pentagon keeps changing in terms of who was involved and how they were involved and what they said and what they didn't say. So I think it seems like the Pentagon denied the National Guard initially during the course of the day, and basically said that, or initially when the breach was first happening, and said that they felt that it would be bad optics for soldiers to be pushing back protesters at the Capitol. It sounds like it's been pretty well reported that it was ultimately the vice president who was the former vice president who was responsible for getting that National Guard response. The Capitol Police, it seems like from the reporting that's been coming out from the officers, it sounds like they also were not prepared for the threat of that day, and they were not deployed sort of in a sufficient capacity and with sufficient equipment to counter what was happening. I see there's a follow-up question regarding reporting about the FBI having intelligence that was ignored. Again, sort of on all of these, I don't know much more than what's been reported out publicly. I don't have any particular specific sources within the Capitol Police. So again, there was, I think there has been reports that there were FBI intelligence bulletins about this, but I know Capitol Police officials or former Capitol Police officials have claimed that they didn't have that memo, or they hadn't seen that memo. So I think sort of it really seems like it's a multi-level security failure where there was a lack of communication among agencies, and there was a lack by a number of agencies to take the threat as seriously as they probably should have.
Mark, along those lines, do you know if this sort of level of threat chatter has been around other protests coming to the Capitol? Perhaps the response was muted because these threats were not dissimilar from threats that have been around in the past with previous demonstrations.
At least from what I've seen, and from what I know from reporting and from sort of keeping an eye on some of those far right communities, this was unlike things we've seen before. This seemed to be unique. I think part of it is that authorities for a while have tended to dismiss these kinds of things coming out of these communities as just sort of extremist talk and not necessarily serious. But I mean, even just publicly on Twitter, if you just looked at Twitter from some of these types of figures, they were making no secret that they wanted to storm the Capitol and that they wanted to get inside the building and take the building over. There was no secret of that fact, and I think really it just comes down to whether security officials were taking those threats seriously or dismissing them as just talk.
I'm going to take Doreen's question and massage it a little bit. How do you see Congress addressing, or do you see any moves by Congress to address the anti-Semitism that was in that crowd and that is prevalent on the far right? Is that the anti-Semitism in that community, is that specifically an issue that's on Congress's radar?
I think it is to an extent. I'm not sure anybody really knows how to address it at this point, though. I know the Speaker Nancy Pelosi in a press conference she had a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was, I guess it was Friday. Yeah, it was last Friday, week ago. Spoke specifically. She said she said she was very specifically, kind of horrified and shocked by that person who was standing outside her office with that Camp Auschwitz shirt. She was speaking about a visit she took with a group of members of Congress a couple of years ago to Auschwitz and to Yad Vashem. So I think it's certainly something that people are aware of and something that is on people's minds, but I can't say that I've heard anything concrete about how anyone plans to address it or what they're planning to do about it.
Can you describe the difference in feeling, or I mean, obviously the difference in feeling was profound, but was there a feeling of hope and security at the inauguration, or were people nervous, or were people just too distracted by Bernie Sanders' mittens to even process it?
Both for security reasons and for coronavirus, they limited the press passes that were available for the inauguration. So I unfortunately was not able to be there in person. But I think there was definitely a lot of nervousness. There were quite a number of members of Congress who said they were wearing bulletproof vests. There were a number of my journalistic colleagues who were saying in the weeks before that they were planning on stocking up on bulletproof vests and helmets, although later the police said that they wouldn't be allowed to wear those to the inauguration. And then within Congress, there's been sort of an ongoing fear, I think, from the Democrats of some of the Republican colleagues. A big issue that's been sort of causing a lot of frustration for some of the Republicans for the last couple of weeks is that the Speaker placed metal detectors outside of the chamber, and everybody has to go through a metal detector to get inside. And a lot of Republicans have been very, very frustrated about that because usually members of Congress don't have to go through security screening to get into the Capitol building. But since quite a number of Republicans have said they intend to carry guns on the floor because they say, oh, well, that's the only way we can prevent something like this from happening again. The Speaker has been trying to prevent that. And one of my colleagues named Matt Fuller at the Huffington Post reported yesterday that he saw a member try to bring a gun through security and he got stopped and then tried to pass it off to somebody else who said they couldn't take it. And then there's other members, I think most famously Lauren Boebert from Colorado, who have just refused to comply with the security screenings. They're now trying to put in place like a $5,000 or $10,000 fine every time that happens. But even as of yesterday, there were people who were just, walking through the metal detector and then just pushing past the guards and refusing to be wanded or open their bags. So, I think I think there's ongoing security concerns. And I know the Dick Durbin, who's the Senate Majority Whip now, was saying that he's anticipating the Senate is probably going to set up metal detectors as well. So
I know you're a reporter, not a historian, but I wonder, do you know if there has ever been a time when Congress people have been armed on the floor of the Congress?
I think what we've seen over the course of the last few weeks indicates that there were quite a number of members of Congress who had, even prior to this, regularly been coming to the floor armed, even sort of on an ongoing basis up to this point. So I think that it seems pretty safe to assume that there are a number of members of Congress who have just been regularly going around armed, yes.
Wow. I want to, we're getting to, or we're at our wrap-up time, but I want to ask the question that Jane has. How are you, you know, as a son of the congregation, how are you personally processing this this experience, which was not a simple reporting exercise, but also, I'd imagine, somewhat traumatic for you?
You know, I've been holding up, I'd say, remarkably well. I've been, you know, just sort of, it hasn't been as traumatic for me, I think, as for some of my colleagues, just because I wasn't there inside the building. I never sort of confronted any of the rioters. I never saw any of them face to face. There was always sort of a level of insulation between what was happening and where I was. So, you know, I think for that reason, I've been sort of less traumatized by it than some of my colleagues. But, you know, I'm holding up well, I'd say. It's certainly not a day I hope to repeat, but and while it was definitely terrifying, I've been hanging in there and hasn't been. I'm doing it right.
Great. Well, I'm sure that everyone joins me in being grateful that that's the case, that you're holding up after this unbelievable experience. You know, Mark, every time that you when you were describing your experience with it, every time something happened, you quoted yourself as saying, "Oh shoot," which I think is a lot calmer than most of us would have been. I'd imagine there would have been more expletives flying.
You know, I think I tried to tone down my language a little bit for the audience.
Okay, okay, good. Well, it's actually that toning down that I wanted to comment on, because I think that what all of us need right now is some toning down, and some removal of the harsh rhetoric of the last number of years. Because by toning down, we can get back to honest debates about policy difference instead of inflammatory rhetoric that can lead to such incredible violence. And as a reporter, you are leading the charge on that. You're shedding light, and you are helping to explain what's going on in ways that are objective and clear, and helping everybody lucky enough to subscribe to Jewish Insider to gain important insights into the issues of our day in a way that is free from the rhetoric that is causing so much trouble. So I want to thank you for that, because that's not just in service of your career, but it's in service of our country in a way that is just so necessary right now. So for me, from the whole congregation, and really from everyone lucky enough to read your work, thank you. Thank you for everything you do.
Really appreciate everybody who came out today. Really appreciate your time, and really appreciate the invitation, Rabbi Goldsmith.
Great. So everyone, go to JewishInsider.com. Sign up for the daily newsletter. You can continue to read Marc's work, or if you haven't read it before, you can start reading Marc's work now that you've heard it straight from the horse's mouth. I want to remind everyone that services tonight are at 6 p.m. We have our annual Social Justice Shabbat. We've got some wonderful music and readings planned for this evening. And then immediately following the service, we're going to hear from Professor Adam Waits, who's going to give us a social psychology perspective on the left-right divide and ways that we might begin to mend that divide. So our Day for America continues this evening, and I hope that everyone will log back on, same address at 6 p.m. tonight. So Marc, again, thank you very much, and to the Rods, Mazel Tov on the incredible accomplishments of your son. And thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much.